All right, it's Tim Greenwood telling a story from, it's called The Christmas Truce. It's by Shepard. And it's based on letters that soldiers wrote back home who were on the front lines in 1914, talking about an event called the Christmas Truce. Christmas Day, 1914. My dear sister Janet, it's 2 o'clock on Christmas morning, and most of the men are asleep in the dugout trenches right now, but I could not go to sleep until I had written to you about the wonderful goings-on of this Christmas Eve. If I had not lived through it myself, I would have thought it fairy tale. Imagine this. While you and the family were sitting in front of the fire singing Christmas carols, we were doing the same thing with enemy soldiers on the battlefields of France. As I told you in my last couple of letters, there's been little fighting of late. In the first few battles of the war, so many men died that both sides have been waiting for reinforcements. But what a terrible waiting it has been. Knowing that at any moment, an artillery shell could land in the trench beside us and explode and maim and kill several men. And it's been raining almost all the time. And the rain fills up the trenches and we have to bail it out with pots and pans, and everything gets muddy. It's caked with mud. It's terrible. And through it all, we couldn't help but wonder about the Germans, because they face the same dangers as us and they slog through the same muck. And what's more, their nearest trench is only 50 yards away. We're only separated by barbed wire on each side and no man's land in between. Sometimes we can even hear their voices. Of course, we hate them when they kill our friends. But other times we make jokes about them and think that we share things in common. And it seems that they have been feeling the same way as us. For just this yesterday morning, Christmas Eve day, we had our first real freeze. We were cold, but we welcomed it, for at least the mud was frozen hard. There was a frost over everything and the sun shone. It was beautiful Christmas weather. And there was little shooting on both sides throughout the day. And by nightfall, we had our first quiet in weeks. We were hoping we'd have a quiet time for the holiday, but we didn't count on it, because we'd been warned to watch out for the Germans, that they might launch a surprise attack to catch us off guard. I lay down in my cot and I must have fallen asleep, starting to get dark. Suddenly my friend Tom was shaking me awake. He said, John, wake up. Come and see what the Germans are doing. I grabbed my rifle and stumbled out of the cot and cautiously lifted my head above the sandbags. And the sight that greeted me, I couldn't believe it. All along the German line were little lights twinkling as far as you could see. What is it? I asked my friend. Christmas trees, he said. And so it was. The Germans had put Christmas trees in front of their trench, and they'd hung candles and lanterns as beacons of goodwill. I couldn't believe it. And then we heard their voices rising up together in song. Stille Nacht, helle Nacht, I didn't know the words. I didn't know the song, but my friend was able to translate it for me. He said, "Silent night, holy night." I don't think I've ever heard words more lovely or meaningful on that night whose darkness was softened by quarter moon. When they finished, we cheered for them. British soldiers cheering for Germans. And then one of our men began to sing, "The First Noel." And we all joined in. Of course, we didn't sound nearly as good as the Germans with their fine harmonies. But they cheered for us. And then they sang, "O Tannenbaum, O Tannenbaum." And then we sang, "O come, all ye faithful." And they joined in, only singing in Latin. "Adeste Fidelis." Germans and British harmonizing across no man's land. I didn't think anything more could have happened, but when we finished, some Germans called out, "British, you come over here. You no shoot, we no shoot." We looked at each other in bewilderment, and then one of our men called out, "No, you come here." And to our astonishment, we saw 2 or 3 men climb up over the barbed wire and begin to walk across no man's land toward us. Well, one of the soldiers beside me, he lifted his gun to the ready, and I'm sure others did the same. But our captain said, "Hold your fire." And he climbed out of the trench and he went to talk to the Germans, and we could hear their voices. And when the captain jumped back in the trench, he had a German cigar in his mouth, and he said, "We've agreed there'll be no shooting till tomorrow at midnight. Men, you may go join the others out there in no man's land. Sentries stay on guard, but all of you stay alert." And we saw more of the Germans climbing out. And then before we knew it, we were climbing out, and there was hundreds of us on both sides. We were mingling and shaking hands with men just hours before we had been trying to kill. The Germans looked much better than us, dressed in their gray uniforms for the holidays. And soon we started a bonfire, and we started to talk. Of course, more of the Germans knew English than we knew German. And I asked one of them why that was. And he said, "Many of us worked in Britain before the war. I myself was a waiter at the Hotel Cecil. Perhaps I served you at your table." "Perhaps you did," I laughed. Another German, he showed me a picture of his family who lived in Munich. His older sister looked so lovely. I said I'd really like to meet her sometime, and he liked that, and he gave me their address. And even those who could not converse, they could still trade things. We traded our cigarettes for their cigars, our corned beef for their sausages, our tea for their coffee. Buttons and badges traded hands, and one of our men even walked off with the infamous German spiked helmet, and I myself traded a pocket knife for a leather equipment belt and a nice souvenir to take back after the war. Newspapers changed hands too, and the Germans roared with laughter when they saw ours. And they said, "You've got it all wrong. France is finished and Russia almost finished as well." We told them that was nonsense. And then one of them said, "You believe your newspapers and we'll believe ours." Well, it's clear that they're being lied to. But I can't help but think, what about our papers? They tell us that these men are monsters, barbarians. And yet, as we talk to them, we see that they have families, they have hopes and dreams, love of country. In other words, they're just like us. Why are we made to believe otherwise? Well, as the night wore on, we sang songs around the fire. We even sang Old Lang Syne. And then it was time to go back to the trenches. And we talked about playing a football game the next day. And as I left, an old German grabbed my hand and said to me, "Good God, Why can't we just have peace and all go home again? And I said to him, that's a question you have to ask your emperor. Perhaps, he said, but I think it's a question we also have to ask our own hearts. And so, my dear sister, what does it mean, this impossible befriending of enemies? Has there ever been a Christmas Eve like this before in history? Here on the front lines, I fear it means little for, well, decent fellows as they are, we're both soldiers and we have our jobs to do. And our job is to drive them home, and never will we shirk that duty. But one cannot help but think what would happen if the spirit that we have experienced here were caught by the nations of the world. Of course, disputes arise. But what would happen if leaders, instead of warnings, they gave gifts? Instead of slurs, they sang songs together. Instead of reprisals, there was presence. Would not war end all at once? Every nation says that they want peace at this time of year. But I really wonder if we want it enough. Your loving brother, John.